Hello everyone and welcome to a list video where I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite Nurse with Wound albums. So, Nurse with Wound is a project that has been going on for decades at this point, and it's one of those cases where we're talking about a project with a massive catalog that has been going on for multiple years, has consistently been throwing albums really long periods of time, and Nurse with Wound are mostly known for their wildly experimental and avant-garde projects that over the years have moved into different directions here and there, but the outlandish and just really bizarre sense is mostly there all the time. And for me at least, I would say that Nurse with Wound has actually managed to be one of the most influential and one of the most significant projects of all time. For me, they have many albums that are unlike anything I've heard before. Many of them are extremely unique and ahead of their time. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the 10 albums that have made me fall in love with Nurse with Wound. Once again, we're not going to include live albums, compilations, or EPs, though if it was to include EPs, the Bacteria Magnet would be number 1. It is a 10 out of 10 EP, one of the greatest projects I have ever heard in my life. But with that being said, here are 10 albums that I love from Nurse with Wound and I suggest you to go and check them out as well. So at first at number 10 we have the Sylvie and Bab's HiFi Companion. Now you're gonna notice a pattern with many Nurse with Wound albums, and that is that most of those albums are extremely obscure, weird and bizarre. So get used of me repeating those words over and over because they're gonna come out in multiple occasions. And this album in particular definitely falls in this category. It is 2 lengthy tracks that mostly go into the sound collage and planterphonic side of things, and there are 2 tracks that are just all over the place, completely chaotic, while also having a very dark and sinister tone, despite sounds at portions at points that might feel kinda silly, but this is something that also adds to the experience, making this much more uncomfortable to sit through. So yeah, this is one of the more underrated albums that for me definitely deserves more recognition, as I do really believe it serves as one of the greatest material from Nurse with Wound. At number 9 is Insect and Individual Silence. Now the 2 first tracks of this album are really great, but for me the final one, Mutilus de Guerre, takes the cake. This is one of the greatest Nurse with Wound songs ever made. It is absolutely horrifying. It is done in a magnificent way, and it's hard to explain why this in particular is stuck in my head, but it is, and it's an absolute amazing experience. The mind-blowing thing about this release for me is that it was done back in 1981. This just sounds so ahead of its time. It's such a forward-thinking and groundbreaking album. I'm really curious how people would feel when they would hear this back at this time. So yeah, for me out of this period of time, this is one of those Nurse with Wound releases that have managed to become really exceptional. At number 8 it's an album that is really hard to pronounce, but I'm just gonna leave the title below. Another sort of early and groundbreaking release that is really short, it's only 31 minutes, so it mostly serves as a mini album. The CD also contains a reworked version of this entire project with a few differences here and there, but this is definitely another one of those occasions where we're talking about a pretty weird album. It's one of those occasions where you have sounds that might be a bit silly, but the chaos and the obscure nature of all of the sounds coming together is enough to make you feel uncomfortable. And this is definitely, in my opinion, one of the most disturbing and off-putting Nurse with Wound releases. A pretty underrated release in my opinion, and if you haven't heard this already, it's definitely one of the greatest Nurse with Wound albums in my opinion, and you definitely need to check this out. At number 7, this is a big one, it's Solely Looking for Lilith. This is definitely one of the most important and one of the most significant Nurse with Wound releases, and it's one of the most unique ones in terms that it goes a bit far away from the really abstract and obscure nature from many of the other releases. Instead of being a quite chaotic one, This is one of the most minimal releases. This is just a basic minimal drone project, but it's done in a way that in my opinion serves as one of the most significant albums in this genre. The dark ambience of these extremely lengthy pieces, which are just loops that are going over and over and over and are just getting stuck in your head, makes for one of the most horrifying experiences ever. This serves amazingly as background horror atmosphere. Some of the sounds presented over here remind me of some of the loops that I would hear on the game Fear, the first Fear, which in my opinion has one of the most effective and greatest horror soundtracks of all time. So for me, the simplicity of Soliloquy for Lilith is enough to make it such an effective project that you should definitely not miss. This is an essential, especially if you're into dark ambient and drone music. At number 6 is another one of the more well-known releases from Nurse with Wound, is Homotopic to Mary. For me, this definitely serves as one of the weirdest albums I've ever heard, and also one of the most disturbing experiences I've had in music form. The tracks over here are an obscure combination of recordings that are constantly unpredictable, and it always meets the fear of the unknown, because you never know what to expect with this, and even after multiple listens, it's still not that easy to sit through, but every listen out of this album is engaging and makes me wanna come back to it. This in my opinion is not the easiest one to get you introduced into Nurse with Wound's music, but it's certainly a must if you're gonna get into their catalog. At number 5, here we have a more recent one, and a much more unexpected. This is Disconnected with Faust. Yes, the krautrock band Faust. And as far as it has a few krautrock elements, it is definitely not what I expected. This is an album that goes a bit more into drone and ambient sides, but this feels more like an obscure Nurse with Wound release. Now I know that at this point Faust was a much different band compared to what they were in their 70s, but still, this is not what I expected. This is one of those releases from Nurse with Wound that you just need to dig a bit deeper into their catalog, and you can't find diamonds like this. This for me is one of my favorite releases. I've already talked about this album in my White House worst to best list, and it's impossible not to mention this again because this is one of the most insane experiences in music ever. This is the most extreme you're ever gonna hear Nurse with Wound. This album is just batshit insane. It feels like a non-stop torture. It is ear-piercing, and I understand why this album is overlooked and it's not easy to get into. But my god, I can think of very few albums that manage to be as harsh as this. So I'm gonna tell it once again. This is an absolute recommendation. At number 3, I've got another fairly more recent release, Huffing Rug Blues. Now this one contains tracks that we see being in different versions on the Bacteria Magnet EP, which for me is a masterpiece of a release, and even if the Huffing Rug Blues versions came first, I mostly find the versions of the Bacteria Magnet to be done even better. But aside from that, this album has many other tracks that manage to steal the show. This is one of the most unique albums I've ever heard. Even in terms of Nurse with Wound standards, this just goes on another level, with vocal jazz elements, with a few sound collages and approaches that tend to have a bit of a more rhythm to it rather than just going into many random directions. And I can't really describe this album into words. This is an album that you have to experience for yourselves because I doubt you'll ever listen to anything else similar to this. At number 2, it is the very first Nurse with Wound release with this massive album title. It is just hard to believe that this album was released back in 1979. This just doesn't feel like an album that was made at this period of time. The debut of Nurse with Wound is definitely one of the greatest instances of an album being ahead of its time. And even if it contains this massive list with hundreds of artists being an inspiration to them, this album is still next level. Even if we had many occasions with avant-garde, experimental, krautrock, music concrete stuff being released before, this one in my opinion still manages to push the boundaries of experimentation that we know for at this time. This album still feels refreshing to this day. It is one of a kind experience. And finally, at number 1, my favorite Nurse with Wound album is Drunk with the Old Man of the Mountains. Now, I've seen that few people view this album as a compilation, but for me, the way I see it, all of the material in this album are completely original. There have been only instances that I know of a few snippets from like the first track or the second being brought up in releases prior to this or later. Other than that though, Drunk with the Old Man of the Mountains is horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. This album is always extremely unpredictable. It has some very imaginative ideas and combinations of sounds coming together that I would never ever expect. It is just batshit crazy, completely bizarre and out there, and an album that manages to be uncomfortable and disturbing from start to finish. In a weird way, this album is extremely inspirational to me. I don't think I've ever managed to stumble upon anything like this before. This is just one of a kind experience, and I just really don't know what else to say other than that this is one of the greatest albums I've ever heard, and it's just completely insane. And that's gonna wrap it up for my top 10 favorite Nurse with Wound albums. What are your favorite albums from the massive Nurse with Wound catalog? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.